It's Wednesday, December 28th, 2016, and this is 3000 NFL Mock Draft, where myself, Kenneth Arthur, and Rob Staten get together and discuss the NFL, the draft, college football, the Seahawks, and whatnot. And we are just approaching here the final game of the 2017 NFL season, as well as the college football playoffs, and the getting through the immensely boring, inconsequential bowl season as well. As you know, everybody is preparing for the 2017 draft and who will be at the top and who will get drafted where. And of course, the NFL playoffs, with the Seahawks definitely going to be involved in those, despite many fan protests as to the quality of the Seahawks this season, as they fall to the Arizona Cardinals 34-31 in their most recent game, and that drops them to 9-5-1. Perhaps a couple of kicks shy of being 11-4 against, with 2 wins over the Cardinals rather than being 0-1-1 this season, and still have a chance at the number 2 seed if the Atlanta Falcons lose to the New Orleans Saints and the Seahawks can beat the San Francisco 49ers. You would think that the latter is extremely probable, while the former is certainly possible. And, regardless of how you feel about the Seahawks' chances versus the Cowboys or, the Falcons or whoever, they may see in the playoffs, a bye week and a home game in the second round, as opposed to no bye week, and if you make it, a road game in the second round. Well, that is an extremely big difference, and one that could be the difference between the Seahawks making the Super Bowl and not making the Super Bowl, as simple as that. So the Seahawks definitely want the Saints to pull out the upset, and we're looking at, still a division rivalry, Drew Brees versus Matt Ryan. I think, the Saints went 2-0 against the Falcons last year. They lost the game earlier this year in a very poorly played game by New Orleans. But the teams are very different since then. Rob, any indications one way or the other that you're feeling about the Saints and Falcons game? The game is in Atlanta, but the Falcons are just 4-3 at home this season. And the Saints, it's always going to be Drew Brees, who is going for his 5th 5,000-yard season. He is just completely, he's become so good that we ignore how good he really is. As he should be, at least mentioned in MVP talks every single season, and he just gets lost in the shuffle because of a bad defense. Any hope there, or what are your thoughts on Saints-Falcons?
Well, personally, I think that Atlanta is going to pulverize New Orleans. I think it's going to be incredibly one-sided. I don't hold out any hope whatsoever that New Orleans are going to win that game. Every time I've seen Atlanta, and maybe it's just the games that I've tuned in for this year, they've looked really, really good. And I know that they've lost games, of course they have, otherwise they'd be where Dallas are. But recently I've seen them and they just look really, really on form. They look like a team that's hitting the straps at the right time, the way that the Seahawks have in the past. And I don't think they're going to do what the Seahawks did on Christmas Eve, which is when handed with an opportunity against a weaker opponent to essentially secure the number 2 seed. The Seahawks blew it. And I don't see this Atlanta team doing that. I just think they're going to be too good. I think they're very balanced. And I think it's going to be a pretty one-sided game by the end of it.
I would have to, I've definitely got more hope than that. I think, it's going to be a high-scoring affair, and I think that obviously this is New Orleans. This is their chance to do something before the season ends. To go to 8-8 and sort of say, like, we've got some more hope for next year. Obviously, Dennis Allen, the defensive coordinator, wants to put together the best game plan possible so that he keeps his job and shows that there is improvement going on with New Orleans. And I mean, the trio of receivers that Drew Brees has to work with this year should have made, I think it'll at least make for an interesting high scoring game. Desmond Trufant out for the Atlanta Falcons. Speaking of, coordinators and how good the Atlanta Falcons are, Kyle Shanahan, the offensive coordinator, obviously it's going to be, I think he's going to get a job this time around. He's 37 years old, and how quickly he has turned around from, basically just being a guy that was coaching for his father in Washington to having to coach the Browns in 2014. And now in his second year with the Atlanta Falcons, really getting the most out of Matt Ryan to put him into this MVP conversation, and to even do it without Julio Jones for a couple weeks. The two-headed monster with Devonta Freeman and Tevin Coleman at running back. It's been really interesting to watch. The Buffalo Bills fired Rex Ryan, and the Jacksonville Jaguars let go of Gus Bradley. We've talked at length about the LA Rams head coaching position. What are your thoughts on the openings for the Bills and for the Jaguars? And does Kyle Shanahan fit either what they want to do, or which coach do you think will fit what they want to do?
Well, the thing about Kyle Shanahan is he's kind of had a mixed run as a coordinator. And when you look at the weapons he's got in Atlanta, I mean, he's done a good job there. But, he's got Matt Ryan, he's got Julio Jones. They've got two running backs who are quite dynamic and have cost reasonably high draft picks. They've got a top 10 pick playing left tackle. Now, if you've got that collection of parts there, and, Matt Ryan's not he's pretty much in the peak years of his career right now. If you have those collection of parts and you play indoors and you play in one of the weaker divisions in football, you should be a prolific offense. And they have been. And, Kyle Shanahan will get some credit for that, and rightly so. But I'm not convinced that it's the kind of evidence that would suggest, well, this guy deserves to be a head coach somewhere. Because the problem is if he goes to Los Angeles, for example, he's not going to have Matt Ryan. He's going to have Jared Goff, who, to be fair, has been absolutely horrible since he became the starter in LA. And there has to be some concern there. They don't have a legitimate receiver. They don't have a very good offensive line. And the other thing they don't have is a first-round pick. So it's not like they can go out and get a new offensive lineman or go and draft John Ross or somebody like that. They just can't do it. So they're stuck with what they've got, essentially, unless they can sort of create some magic in free agency. So while it's an attractive job for any prospective coach, to get to go to LA, nice new project there. And there are some nice players in Los Angeles. Aaron Donald, for example, who wouldn't want to work with him? It is a nice little project for somebody, but I don't think that necessarily Kyle Shanahan's going to go in there and create a storm. In terms of the other openings, I think Buffalo probably made the move this week because they are a little bit concerned that Tom Coughlin is speaking to Jacksonville. It's all signs seem to be pointing towards either Anthony Lynn getting the job. He's the interim head coach. Either he gets it full time, or Tom Coughlin comes in and he takes over in Buffalo. It's a bit of a weird situation where the owners and the GMs seem to be pushing Tyrod Taylor out the door, who's had a pretty good year, probably not worth major franchise quarterback money though. But they're going to give EJ Manuel another go. So don't hold out much hope for Buffalo winning their final game. But it's kind of an interesting scenario that they have there, that the GM Doug Whaley seems to be untouchable, a bit like Trent Bolker was in San Francisco previously. And now they're going to maybe go out and get someone like Coughlin, who, they've got some talent in Buffalo, but they really need some, to put down some roots now and stand by a coach and a plan. And then when you look at the other openings, Jacksonville, I don't envy whoever goes in there because it's not a great franchise. It's not a great club. Blake Bortles really needs to be replaced. They might have to do that in the first round again, and it's one of the toughest drafts to do that. Are they going to go out and trade for a quarterback? So that's going to be a tough gig for anybody. And then you wonder whether San Francisco are going to be looking for a new head coach and a new GM. And that would be a pretty attractive job, even though it's been a bit of a disaster in San Francisco in recent years. When you fire two coaches in 2 years, if Chip Kelly does go, at least you think the next guy's going to be given a chance. They're not going to be paying off three coaches while employing a fourth this time next year. And the next guy's going to come in and probably be rid of Trent Baalke as well. And they're going to be able to go in there, rebuild that club. So I think of all the openings that could come up, San Francisco might be the most attractive eventually.
You talked about Tom Coughlin. What is the interest around Tom Coughlin at this point? He's 70 years old. He got his start in coaching as a graduate assistant in 1969. His last go with the New York Giants was totally bad, except for 2 Super Bowl championships. There's so many. It seems like there's so many other guys with higher upside. And if you look around the NFL right now with, the success of Adam Gase and, maybe some of the younger head coaches, I mean, I guess you could talk to, Gary Kubiak winning a Super Bowl with the Broncos, or Jack Del Rio having success with the Oakland Raiders right now, but none of them are 70 years old. He's older than Pete Carroll. He'd be the oldest coach in the NFL, but the Jaguars are interviewing him. You say the Bills might want to get in there quickly to interview him. Do you see there being a successful end of the road with, hiring Tom Coughlin?
Probably not now, but I guess what the appeal is that he has won 2 Super Bowls with teams in New York that they're not the New England Patriots, they're not the 2013 Seahawks, they're not Denver with the defense that they had last year. It's Eli Manning, and everybody who watches Eli Manning now, if you didn't know, if you just started following the NFL in the last couple of years and said this guy's won 2 Super Bowls, they would say, well, what happened? Did he have a serious injury or something? And he got he won a Super Bowl with a 9-7 team. So, I mean, I guess what these clubs are looking at is thinking, this guy will come in, and as long as he gets us into the playoffs, we might well have a chance, because that's what the situation was in New York. I think it also speaks to the lack of really good, experienced options out there. I mean, a lot of the guys that would potentially be up for jobs, the likes of John Gruden, for example, don't seem to want to get back into coaching. There are several others as well who just seem to have switched off from it. And we kind of need to have a new generation of coaches coming through, younger coaches who are maybe going to fail or have a couple of jobs before they become the next sort of spate of experienced guys. And there aren't that many out there. I mean, if you're looking for a proven thing, I think it's something that Stan Kroenke in LA will want. He will want somebody who can run his organization. That's what he has with his other clubs, including Arsenal in the Premier League over here. He has people who run the team from top to bottom for him. He doesn't want to have too much involvement. And when he looks across and sort of sees the options there just aren't that many. And while ever Harbaugh's saying he's not going to leave Michigan and Gruden says he's not going to coach unless you can maybe get a deal for someone like Sean Payton in New Orleans, which, that rumor emerged again last week that he may be available to go and move on and get a change of scenery. Unless you're going to go for something like that, there aren't many experienced options out there. So if you want an experienced coach and you don't want to take a chance on a Kyle Shanahan or Vance Joseph or people like that, then I guess Coughlin would be considered a safe pair of hands.
Yeah. What other, you mentioned the San Francisco 49ers eventually becoming available, perhaps. Did you think the Seahawks are playing the 49ers this week? Colin Kaepernick, sort of talked about, the way he talks about this game is that how he talks about it in sort of the sense of like, look, this is my last game with the 49ers. You look at the 49ers now, and they're 2-13. They're the worst run defense in the NFL. They're the worst passing offense in the NFL by many measures, the worst defense in the NFL. There's so much to do, it seems like, with San Francisco, including, starting over with Kaepernick, who quietly, has 15 touchdowns, 4 interceptions. You would think that it's just a lot worse. It's not great, but he is still averaging 7.1 yards per carry. And it would seem like in the right system or whatever with the right players, this is not too different than the Colin Kaepernick who was the quarterback for San Francisco when they went to the Super Bowl and when they were a Super Bowl contending team. And everything else, it seems like, besides Colin Kaepernick, is what has changed between, the retirements and the players leaving via free agency and players getting older and just getting injured and the coaching changes and everything like that. There's a reason to think that, hey, nobody wants to keep Colin Kaepernick around on a major contract. So there's always the money to be taken into consideration. But as we do get a look at Colin Kaepernick this weekend against the Seahawks, any thoughts on the future of him? And, do you think that Chip Kelly has already basically been fired?
Well, for a while it seemed that Chip Kelly was going to keep his job, and then that sentiment has changed in the last few days. If you listen to podcasts or you listen to sort of these NFL insider things they do before the games now, there seems to be a growing feeling that he's going to lose his job and that they're going to sort of clean house and start again, which really needs to be done because you can't have, they're going to get rid of Trent Baalke, they're going to get a new GM. You don't want to burden, and I mean that in the nicest possible way, but you don't want to burden the new GM with a coach like Chip Kelly who is known for sort of wanting to do things his way. is known to be, very much quite an intense guy. And if you're a GM and you're going in there, you're probably going to want to hire your own coach. They might want to go the way the Seahawks have done and hire like this kind of like team president / head coach type of thing to lead it. I think it's going to be an attractive job for somebody because, like I say, I mean, whoever gets the gig there is not going to be under much pressure if they've just fired Chip Kelly. They'll be paying off Jim Tomsula next year. They'll be paying off Chip Kelly. They'll be paying 3 coaches essentially in 2017. They're unlikely to want to be paying 4 coaches in 2018. So whoever comes in is probably going to get the kind of time that Chip Kelly's not going to have. They're going to have the time to try and find a new quarterback. They're going to have the time to completely rebuild the offense. They're not going to be able to come in and turn that roster into a championship team straight away. They probably are going to go right back to the start. I haven't got a clue who is the type of person they would look for to do that. I mean, they may well look in the college ranks. Is someone like David Shaw willing to sort of move because it's fairly close to home? I don't know. I mean, that might be the kind of thing that they look for there, but they're going to need to give somebody ultimate power if they're going to do that. They could go back here. Sean Payton could be an option for them. And unlike the Rams, they've got the draft picks to maybe make a move there with New Orleans. In terms of San Francisco overall, Kenny, just briefly, I'm a little bit concerned about this game because it's one of those where it's at the end of the year. The Seahawks have got kind of everything to lose, really. They're the ones who are going into the playoffs. They're the ones who are going to be playing again. San Francisco are kind of, they're going to have half an eye on the off season, and it'll either go one of two ways. Either the Seahawks will just go in there, get ahead early, and we'll see a San Francisco team and a roster that is thinking about its holidays in the next couple of weeks. Or we're going to see a San Francisco team that sadly are going to sort of compound the misery of what has been a very tough run-in for the Seahawks. And, with respect to the Seahawks, this feels kind of like it has the general feel of a 9-7 type season. And if they lose the game, they'll be 9-6-1. And my fear is that they probably are a 9-7 team, and they may well be that by the end of this game. I genuinely hope that isn't the case. I think we could all do with seeing the Seahawks just roll over the 49ers, run the ball effectively. They should at the very least be able to do that for the first time in weeks, because San Francisco are giving up 5 yards a carry. I mean, that's incredible. To give up an average of 5 yards a carry every time running backs run the ball against you is just unheard of. So, I mean, they should be able to sort that out a little bit and maybe just get some momentum. I don't think they're going to get the bye. I think they're going to have to play the week after in the wild card, probably against, someone like Washington, for example, which is a winnable game at CenturyLink Field, but then they have to go on the road, which is where they've struggled against the NFC. So, I'm a little bit concerned for this one, and I hope that, as it is going to be Colin Kaepernick's last game with the team, that he is not going to get one final flourish against the Seahawks.
Just a few more coaching stuff around the league. If I just say, the team, and you tell me whether or not you think that coach will be fired, and then maybe if they should be fired, whether it's the right decision or not. I know I believe the Jets have already said that Todd Bowles is coming back, or Todd Bowles is coming back. It sounds like that's going to be the case. The Bills are obviously in the market. The Cincinnati Bengals, it sounds like Marvin Lewis, he's planning on coming back. And if they haven't fired him at this point, you would think they're probably going to stick with the plan there. What about Hugh Jackson with the Browns?
Yeah, I think that Hugh Jackson will stay with the Browns. I know they've had a really, really bad year, but I think that team has realised they can't just keep doing this again. That the reason why they're 1-14 is because they have changed coaches so often, that they've changed regimes so often. They've committed to this. I didn't like their first draft class overall, and I would be concerned about their ability to do this one right that's coming up as well. They just look like a franchise that for a long time has needed somebody who can go in there and run the thing from the top. A bit like Carroll has in Seattle, and the owner needs to butt out of it and let them get on with it. And I don't think they've got that. But I don't see them firing Hugh Jackson. I think he's going to get at least another year.
What about Chuck Pagano and the Colts?
See, that's an interesting one, isn't it? Because they have at times looked, they've looked quite capable. I mean, they beat Green Bay in Green Bay, which is a lot. Their performance there was a lot better than Seattle's. They've they've looked good at times, and then they've looked horrible at times as well. And there's this weird thing. I saw a great stat actually, which was compared to the first few years of Peyton Manning's career, the Colts have actually won a lot more games in Andrew Luck's first few years of his career than Peyton Manning did in his. And that is going to be the argument, I suppose, for sticking by this coaching team. The problem is that Kenny, when the Seahawks were kind of making their rise with Russell Wilson as the quarterback, they were building momentum. They were starting to become a contender. You could see everything coming together. And Indianapolis were in a very similar position. I mean, they beat the Seahawks in 2013. They were in a very similar position. They were getting to AFC Championship games. But because the way that they've built the roster has been so bad, it's just been horrendous. I mean, they've just underachieved so much. I'm not convinced, actually, that Pagano is necessarily the big issue. It's probably Grigson, the GM, who's the main problem. I mean, he's done such a bad job overall of putting that roster together. He might be the one who really deserves to go. But I guess because they signed extensions last year, they're going to come as a package. So I think if they were going to fire them, they probably would have done it a year ago. They'll probably meander on for a few more years still. But it's very hard to imagine the Colts winning anything under Pagano.
The Jacksonville Jaguars obviously have their opening, and then moving on, the San Diego Chargers and Mike McCoy. Any chance do you think that he can keep his job there?
Well, you would say no, but because of the difficulty with where they're actually going to be playing next year, you just wonder whether or not they'll stick with him, because it'll be too much hassle to go through a coaching change while they try and work out whether they're going to be playing in Los Angeles. So it might be one of those things where the owner's just got bigger fish to fry and will just concentrate solely on the future of the franchise instead of the future of the team. But it's a shame. Mike McCoy had quite a good start in San Diego, and they have been competitive even though they've been losing. But they're just a bit of a nothing franchise. They have a franchise quarterback. They have some good players, but they never really seem to go anywhere with it. So we'll see. It will show how ambitious they want to be while they potentially play out, like a season in front of no fans in San Diego next year. We'll see how ambitious they want to be, or whether or not they just want to take the lumps for a year or two with McCoy and then make the change for when they seemingly inevitably move to LA.
And, the only other team that's really doing poorly that still hasn't fired their coach yet, the Chicago Bears at 3-12. They got to win this past weekend. And you would think with someone like John Fox, maybe you do play a longer game there, as opposed to maybe pulling the rug underneath a younger coach a little bit quicker because of the uncertainty. Any thoughts that the Bears would fire John Fox?
Well, I suspect they would consider it. Maybe one of the mistakes they made was, if you remember, Lovie Smith was sort of the surprise fire a year ago because they wanted to promote Dirk Cutter. They didn't want to lose him as the offensive coordinator. So they fired Smith to keep the OC. Maybe Chicago should have done the same with Adam Gase. I mean, it's easy to use sort of hindsight, but Gase has done such a good job in Miami and looks like, one of the blossoming great coaches in the NFL. And now John Fox is there as a bit of a, considered a bit of a dinosaur, really. But and a very conservative coach. But the one thing is with him is he is, he's had success. He took Denver to a Super Bowl, took Carolina to a Super Bowl. Carolina were competitive for years with him there. Denver were competitive with him there. I know he had Peyton Manning, but still, they set records and everything. So, when you look at the situation now, I think it could go either way. You kind of have to ask, what would Chicago do otherwise? Is there anybody who sort of stands out who could come in there and do a better job? And then you have to consider what Fox has had to contend with. One, he's had Jay Cutler as his quarterback, which is not an enviable position. He's going to go. They're going to need to draft a new quarterback. Their defense has not been great. Their offense is, it doesn't really have anything that they can hang their hat on. So this is a rebuild for Chicago. And I can think of worse coaches actually to be in charge of that.
And if there was one more to really talk about, as you said, firing the head coach to keep the coordinator, if the Detroit Lions lose this weekend and fall out of the playoffs to the Green Bay Packers, because having collapsed and lost their last 3 games of the season when they were, had some control over the NFC North, Jim Caldwell, not that exciting of a coach, but both of their coordinators, Jim Bob Cooter and Terrell Austin, are expected to get a considerable amount of interviews this year for other jobs. Any thoughts that if they lose, the Lions would fire Jim Caldwell and maybe promote one of those guys?
It's an interesting topic, really, because I think you've just hit it on the head there. They've got two coordinators who are really highly rated, and maybe it's going to just come a bit soon for Jim Bob Cooter, but you have to like what he's done with the offense there, especially having lost Calvin Johnson and not having a running back of any note, at least a healthy one. They've still been really, really productive on offense and have had some really nice come from behind wins in the fourth quarter. And Matt Stafford, I know he looked pretty awful in the second half against Dallas the other night, but that side has looked really good this year. So you would imagine that he would get some looks. I think I really like the defensive coordinator in Detroit, and I would imagine he's going to get a lot of looks this off season again. I think he deserves the opportunity to do this again. He's a guy who, they looked really good a few years ago when they had Ndamukong Suh and one or two others in there. But then they lost Ndamukong Suh. They've kind of got a bunch of no-namers replacing him, and yet they're still pretty good. So, I think that if they felt like they really didn't want to lose one of those two guys, they may be prepared to sort of move on from Caldwell. But at the same time, he was appointed to replace Tony Dungy in Indianapolis for a reason. He was a highly rated coach, and perhaps was unfortunate that he lost his job in Indianapolis because of Peyton Manning's bad neck. And if Peyton Manning hadn't got injured that year, the Colts probably would have been a Super Bowl contender. Instead, they got the number 1 overall pick, and he lost his job because the depth of the roster was so bad that they couldn't survive without Manning. So he was perhaps a bit unlucky to lose his job. And he's gone to Detroit and has done pretty well. So I remember when they appointed Caldwell, they were trying to get Ken Wisenhunt, and it was seen as like, a big loss that Wisenhunt went to Tennessee, wasn't it, instead? Wisenhunt lasted 5 minutes in Tennessee, and Caldwell's actually done pretty well. So maybe they should stick with that guy.
Moving on to the NFL playoffs a little bit, not the teams that are struggling, but maybe the teams that are doing a little bit better. The Seahawks, it sounds like, obviously, from what you've said, Rob, you believe that the Falcons will be the number 2 seed, which means that as long as the Seahawks beat the 49ers, they'll be the number 3 seed. The Packers and the Lions playing for the NFC North on Sunday, so the winner of that game will be the 4 seed. And if the Washington Redskins can win their game, as long as the Packers and Lions don't tie, the Redskins will be the 6th seed. It would be, once again, the Seahawks and the Redskins in the first round of the playoffs. If you go back to Washington's playoff history, they lost to the Seahawks in 2000. I want to make sure that I don't get this wrong. They lost to the Seahawks in 2012. They lost to the Seahawks in
Super Bowl season in 2007, wasn't it? And then it was the Russell Wilson rookie season.
Yeah. So anyway, they've lost to the Seahawks in 3 of their last 4 playoff games, and then the most recent loss was to the Packers last year. Any thoughts? If you believe that the Falcons will have no problems with the Saints and that the Seahawks won't have too many problems with the 49ers. Well, first of all, do you think the Redskins can and will beat the Giants? The Giants saying they're not going to rest any of their players. They're going to play a normal game. So do you believe the Redskins will win? And if the Redskins don't win, either way, who do you think has that advantage in the Lions and Packers game?
Well, Washington's at home, so I think there's a decent chance they will win the game. And in terms of the Detroit-Green Bay game, I think it's pretty hard to call because it's in Detroit, so you would say that would give them an edge. But you just can't. I mean, Aaron Rodgers is playing well at the moment. Green Bay are playing well. When it's on the line, I would rather avoid Green Bay. I mean, if I was the rest of the NFC, I would be rooting for Detroit. Get Green Bay out of the playoffs. You do not want to see them in there. And I personally, as a Seahawks fan, will be hoping that Detroit win that game. I don't want anything to do with Aaron Rodgers in the postseason, but I've got a feeling that Green Bay are going to win. I think they'll pull it out, and I think they'll be a threat. I think they'll be a real dangerous team in the playoffs. It's kind of got the make of a year where it's going to be one of those wild card teams in the NFC that is going to sneak through this thing. I'm really impressed with Dallas. A lot of people sort of say, it's a weird dynamic that Dallas are gonna finish 14-2 or something like that, and yet people constantly, I hear this opinion that, well, it's kind of likely that Dallas are going to lose a playoff game, that Dallas aren't going to make the Super Bowl, and I kind of feel the other way. I think who's going to beat Dallas? Who's going to be able to stop that offense? And the defense is not great in Dallas, yet they've played pretty well all year. They don't. It's about the thing about the NFL is that if you've got major strengths, accentuate them and try not to make your weaker areas, a major problem. And that's something the Seahawks are not done well this year. Seattle's weaknesses, like the offensive line against Arizona, have cost them games. And it was the same in Tampa Bay. And they've not been able to sort of manage the weaknesses in the roster. Dallas have managed a substandard defense all year. They've actually made it look pretty good. So I think that they're going to be pretty strong. But the general playoff picture, I think it's looking likely the Seahawks are going to play Washington. I remember, I can't remember who I was talking to, but a Washington fan said that he found the Seahawks really annoying. This was after the 2012 playoff game. He found the Seahawks really annoying because every time Washington seems to go on a bit of a run and actually do something and get to the postseason, the Seahawks are always waiting there to finish the year, knock them out of the playoffs. And it's always kind of like in quite comprehensive style in the end. And the last three playoff games have been kind of strange. So, it'd be nice for that to happen again. But I'm genuinely concerned. My concern, as we've been doing these podcasts, Kenny, over the last few weeks, my concern for the Seahawks has grown and grown and grown and grown. It's not an overreaction to the Arizona game. It's something that I've been saying for a couple of weeks now, that I'm bothered by what the Seahawks are doing right now. And I really hope that they're going to be, the flawed champion, that they're going to be the 2011 Giants, or they're going to be Baltimore, who stumbled into the playoffs and won the Super Bowl and beat the Niners because Joe Flacco got hot. I hope that that's going to be, Russell Wilson has a great postseason and he does what Flacco did that year. I hope that they're going to be, Denver last year, choosing whether to go with Manning or Brock Osweiler before the playoffs and still somehow winning the thing. But it's really, really difficult to believe in the Seahawks. There are a lot of issues on that team right now. And the sort of the question I'm asking myself a lot at the moment is not so much, whether or not they're good enough to win this year. It's, are we seeing the slow decline of this era of Seahawks football? Is it just a down year? Is it kind of like a down year and a half, with last year as well? Can they get back to their highest season? Or are we just seeing a very, very slow decline with this group? That's the question I'm a little bit concerned about right now.
Well, and what do you think about, another interesting topic that'll come up in the offseason, and especially something that we'll be talking about if the Seahawks do host the Redskins in the first round of the playoffs, is the future of Kirk Cousins, someone who, was drafted around after Russell Wilson in 2012, spent 3 years, behind Robert Griffin III before taking over in 2015. And over the last 2 seasons has completed 68.5% of his passes, averaging, over 300 just about almost 300 passing yards a game, averaging 26 touchdowns and 10 interceptions per year. His interception rate of 1.9% is really, really good. His passer yards per attempt, 7.9 over the last 2 seasons. And the Redskins are on 1 win away from going to their second straight playoff, appearance, which is something that, hasn't happened for Washington since 1992. So, are they going to, then there's going to be the decision of whether or not to place the franchise tag on him again, which will cost like $24 million, or to bite the bullet and say, look, this guy is every bit of a franchise quarterback as, Russell Wilson is, which is an opinion that I'm sure people have. Some people have. What are your opinions on Kirk Cousins and what the Washington Redskins will do with him contract-wise?
Well, if you remember, didn't he shout at the GM, McLuhan, after one of the recent games, something like, "How you like me now?" And my response to that, if I was Scott McLuhan, would be exactly the same as I did a year ago, which is kind of like Washington are one of those teams. I think the term is QB purgatory. You've got a guy that can help you win games. You will make the playoffs occasionally, if not most years, but you never quite feel like they're the best of the best, a top 6 or 7 quarterback. They're kind of just beyond that. And there are times when you watch Kirk Cousins and he's slinging the ball around, he looks really good, and then he starts shouting at a camera somewhere and demanding everybody give him some credit. And then, a couple of weeks later, you'll watch him and he'll throw a horrible interception and he will get stalled. And you realize that, do you know what he is? He's kind of like a notch below Andy Dalton. He's a notch above someone like Ryan Tannehill and probably a notch below Andy Dalton. And is that ever going to win you a championship? So that's the question you kind of have to ask. And this is the issue that Washington will have, because the last thing they want to do is watch Kirk Cousins walk out the door, go and sign for somebody else, and do what he's been doing for the last couple of years, which is, score a load of touchdowns, minimize turnovers the best he can. And then you're left with nobody and having to sort of scramble around in the draft looking for somebody or a free agent, or having to make a trade. And then if that doesn't work, you just look stupid. But the alternative of just paying Kirk Cousins, several million more a year than Russell Wilson's earning is a pretty frightening prospect as well, because then, a substantial portion of your cap is being taken up by Kirk Cousins. So what do you do? And like the decision, I really don't. It's best. You're best as a team to either have a definitive answer at quarterback. So Russell Wilson, Ben Roethlisberger, Aaron Rodgers, Tom Brady, people like that. It's best to have that, or just nothing at all, and to be looking for one of those guys. Being caught somewhere in the middle is really tough. That's why it's QB purgatory, and it's very rare that a player in that kind of middle ground wins a Super Bowl. Now, Joe Flacco did it, but it doesn't happen that often. So, it's a tough one for Washington, but I suspect what they will do is probably put him on the franchise tag again. But then in a year's time, they will have a decision to make, because that won't be possible anymore. It'll be so high, or I don't know what the rules are, but I think the feeling is that they will put him on the franchise tag one more time, and then they will have to make a decision after the 2017 season.
What are your thoughts so far on the AFC playoffs? With you got the injuries to Derek Carr, and that knocking him out, and then also the Miami Dolphins currently going with Matt Moore. There's some hope that Ryan Tannehill, I think, can return for the wild card round, but it's an interesting year in which it seems like, how is anybody going to stop the New England Patriots? Do you see anyone in the AFC stopping the Patriots, with the fact that they're going to be 14-2 probably? They have the best quarterback. He's thrown 2 interceptions all season long. And everybody else, is going out with, Tom Savage, Matt McGloin, perhaps Matt Moore, or Ryan Tannehill, who's, a first-time playoff QB if he makes it to the game. And then you've got the Kansas City Chiefs, who, do have a lot of the good pieces that you'd want in a team, but perhaps not the explosive offense that you're going to see because of Alex Smith. And then you've got the Pittsburgh Steelers, who do have the quarterback that can go up against Tom Brady or anyone else with Ben Roethlisberger, and they have got Le'Veon Bell, and they've got Antonio Brown. But this is still a team that is 10-5 for a reason, and they've won. They were 4-5 after 9 games. They've won 6 in a row, and I don't know if their schedule has been very difficult, beating the Browns and the Bengals, and then just sort of being the softish defensive team that doesn't have the stars that they did in the 2000s when they were, winning Super Bowls, and hasn't been to the Super Bowl since 2010, and sort of struggled in the playoffs in the 6 years since then. So what are your overall thoughts on the AFC in terms of, can anyone stop the New England Patriots this year?
Well, I think the answer is probably no. I hate to say a team as good as New England, who has coached as well as they are and quarterbacked as well as they are really, really lucky. But that is kind of how it is in New England, isn't it? I mean, you look at the AFC picture. I mean, Oakland losing Derek Carr. I mean, Derek Carr has looked so good this year. And I was watching, I had half an eye on the red zone where Oakland were playing Indianapolis on Christmas Eve, and there was something like, it was like 35-7 or something like that. And then Derek Carr goes out the game, and Indianapolis almost came back and tied the game. So it goes to show the impact of losing him and what that's going to have on Oakland. I cannot imagine that Matt McGloin is going to lead Oakland to the Super Bowl. Now, Derek Carr could have done. I could have imagined Derek Carr and Oakland beating New England. You look at the rest of the AFC. I think you're right on Pittsburgh. It's impossible really to trust their defense. Ben Roethlisberger seems to be, that he has these games like he did the other night where he can lead the team, storming back, and it's, there's Ben, he's going again, he's slinging it around, he's looking really tough. But then he seems to have these games as well where if it doesn't quite click in for him, I remember the game when they played New England after New England had, the first game of the season after New England had beaten Seattle in the Super Bowl. Ben didn't really do anything in that game. And, while they've got Le'Veon Bell and others, you would say that, they've got a chance in that one, but you would still fancy New England to beat Pittsburgh. I don't see any threat with Matt Moore's led Miami team. Houston are not going to do anything. They'll do what they always do in the playoffs. And Kansas City will probably do everything or what they do in the playoffs, which is they'll probably blow out Houston in the first round, and then they will probably go to New England and get absolutely trounced, which is I think what happened a year ago, isn't it? So I think whoever wins the NFC is going to be playing New England in the Super Bowl. The NFC is a lot closer because you could imagine Green Bay getting into the Super Bowl. You could imagine Dallas getting there, of course. Atlanta, I think it's going to be tough for the Seahawks, but you wouldn't rule it out completely given their roster. They've got players. They've got a very talented roster. It's just whether or not they can come together. And we know that the Giants have done it in the past, and even Detroit have looked tough at times. So NFC looks very interesting. AFC looks entirely predictable.
Moving on to some college football stuff. The bowl season is, hopefully mercifully coming to an end soon. It's the 28th, so coming out on the there's some games today, there's some games this weekend, and then we'll get into the college football playoff in the beginning of the year. I'm just looking at it now. There was a game yesterday, the Heart of Dallas Bowl. North Texas fell to 5-8. How is a 5-8 team playing a bowl game? And they took overtime for Army to beat them. A team that I'm very near and dear to my heart. Washington State lost to Minnesota 17-12. The Cougs looked terrible, and it doesn't boost anyone's morale, right? To have to play these games. I would be fine with it if we scrapped all of them, but and I would be. And as far as skipping games, skip them. Everybody skip them. Freshmen, coaches, I do not care. But it is live action football games between certain players. Rob, in terms of prospects that you're looking for in the draft next year, is there any buzz going on about bowl game performances? Is there anybody who's really seeing go way up or go way down from these nondescript middling bowl games?
No, there isn't. The thing is that the only real benefit they have, Kenny, is there are a lot of fans NFL fans, that is, who will maybe they don't spend much time watching college football, but now that we're in late December, maybe their team's going to be picking in the top 10. A bowl game potentially gives them an opportunity to look at a couple of guys, live, who their team is being, if they've read a mock draft somewhere that says, this guy for Texas A&M is going to be the number 8 overall pick or something, and they know they're going to have a pick in that range, they might watch him just to see it. But aside from that, there's no real benefit. I watched the Pittsburgh game against Northwestern earlier, and as soon as anybody got a little bit hurt, they were pulling them out of the game. So, some of the prospects you would want to watch in that one, like James Conner, the running back, left the game with a head injury, just got changed and didn't play another snap. Pittsburgh pulled their quarterback. They had players in the secondary they pulled out. And then none of those injuries looked particularly serious, but they just pulled them out. And then Dorian Johnson, who's the very talented left guard, actually got a pretty serious ankle injury. And you're thinking, well, I'm seeing the two main reasons why this is a waste of time. On the one hand, minor injuries, and you're pulling guys out of the game that they wouldn't be pulled out for if this was the ACC championship or whatever. You're pulling them out of the game because it doesn't matter. And then you're seeing a guy who has legitimately could go in the second round, who'd been invited to the Senior Bowl, who we all wanted to see compete in Mobile, we all wanted to see him at the Combine, has now got a serious ankle injury playing in, an exhibition game. So for two reasons there, bad, negative things about these bowls. There are too many of them for a start. You mentioned there was a 5 and 7 teams in a bowl game. The game that's on right now is West Virginia, who are ranked number 16 against Miami, who are unranked. I mean, like, who cares? It's just not a very interesting game. And I think we talked about this recently. My ideal would be to just have a bigger playoff, games that actually matter, involving maybe whether it was 8 teams, 12 teams, 16 teams, or whatever. Let's have a 16-team playoff, and just get rid of the bowl games and call the quarterfinals. Give them all call it the pinstripe bowl, whatever you want to, if you have to. And let's have a proper playoff, because they're games that will matter. The players aren't going to pull out of these games. They're going to be important because you're playing for something. They're not just exhibitions, and you're also not going to get really, really bad teams playing in them that nobody cares about. So that would be my ideal, to see a 16-team playoff and just get rid of these pointless bowl games.
In the bowl games that do have, consequence, which is, the 2 games that'll lead to the national championship, you've got Alabama, who's going to have, 25 future NFL players. You've got Clemson, Washington, and Ohio State. There's going to be a lot of NFL players there. Anybody, it's interesting what I read today, which was that Marlon Humphrey, the cornerback for Alabama, who could be a top 5 pick, he is very good, and he is very he shuts down a lot of passes, but then he is averaging 16.3 yards per catch that he does give up. So it seems like he's prone to allowing big plays in a similar way to the way that we talked about Vernon Hargraves a year ago. Maybe they're not the same type of player or cornerback, but seeing that, like, look, this guy's gets so highly rated, but watch this play where he'll give up, a 40-yard touchdown or whatever. Is that how you see Marlon Humphrey? And what are some of the players in those top 4 teams? Anybody that you're really looking to have, a transcendent performance going into the draft next year?
Well, my impression of Marlon Humphreys is that he's the best. I mean, I wasn't a big fan of Vernon Hargreaves a year ago, but I love watching Humphreys play. I have to say that whenever I've watched Alabama, I've not noticed him giving up big plays at all. And I can only imagine that maybe the defense is just so aggressive, so talented, so better than the opponent, that maybe there's been a couple of times when he's cheated and got beat. I don't know. It also could be, I don't know how many times the teams have thrown against him. It can't be very often. If he's only been thrown at, I'm just going to pluck a figure out of the air here. If he's been thrown at, let's say, 25 times this year, that might be 30 times less than, an average cornerback. And if, when he has been thrown at, if he has occasionally given up some big plays, that average will obviously go up as a consequence of that. But it's not taking into account the fact that maybe teams are completely avoiding his side of the field in a lot of these games and don't want to challenge him. So, it's kind of swings and roundabouts on that. You can twist a statistic either way, but I would expect Humphreys to go in the top 12, if not the top 10. I think he's going to be really good. I think there are some interesting games coming up where there are prospects involved. I think the best thing is that what happens now is the bowl game gets played, Kenny, and then you find out at last whether someone's going to declare for the draft. So, for example, Utah are playing today, and we'll finally probably get to know in the next sort of 24 hours whether or not Garrett Bowles is going to declare for the draft, who's one of my favorite prospects in this draft class. And there are 1 or 2 others that we're not 100% sure about. When Washington have played, whether if they lose to Alabama, we'll find out about 5 or 6 guys on their roster who are very interesting. Whether or not they're going to turn pro. And by the sort of second week in January, we'll have an idea of who's going to be in this draft. And that for me is the good thing. I'm a bit tired of these meaningless bowl games. I've not watched a lot of them. I've watched so much college football. The stuff that matters during the year. I don't think there's a great deal to be learned from these games at all. But I'm looking forward to. I've already warned my wife that New Year's Eve. The thing is, they play the games on New Year's Eve. The Washington Alabama game kicks off at about 11 o'clock at night over here in the UK. So I will literally, as the clock strikes 12, be watching Washington against Alabama. We're not going to go anywhere. My wife's pregnant, so we're not going to be hitting the town or anything and drinking. So we're going to watch Washington against Alabama. That is how we're going to bring in 2017. So I look forward to that game, but not many of the others.
Another interesting conversation that I sort of just peeped, eavesdropped or looked into on Twitter was about Jabril Peppers, the safety at Michigan, and sort of talk about how he's such a divisive prospect in the draft next year. And it sort of made me want to ask you again about your evaluation of Peppers, because one guy was saying, or asked why don't some people like Peppers, and it was like, find me 5 plays that aren't returns that were good plays by Peppers. I mean, like extremely like game-changing type plays, whether it's on defense or whatever. And he was like, look, you can't find them. They don't exist. He is a return guy. And it reminds me a little bit of Desmond Howard, who in 1992, also a Michigan alum, won the Heisman Trophy. Peppers was a Heisman Trophy finalist, was drafted 4th overall. Peppers, there might be enough buzz for Peppers to get him in the top 10 or something like that. And then you look at the career of Desmond Howard, and he was at best an undrafted free agent. That's what he should have been. He had, very little production. He had one season where he was kind of productive as a receiver for Washington, and that was it. And everything else was, as a punt returner or a kick returner, which is something that you can find at all stages of the draft and even after the draft, or just wherever they're available. And so like with Peppers, it seems like, look, is this guy going to be top 10 pick, or is this guy going to go into the 5th round? I don't think that he's going to go in the 5th round, but it takes just one team to decide that they think Peppers is a top 10 pick to make him a top 10 pick, right? What do you think he should be, and where do you think he will go?
Yeah, unfortunately, Kenny, this is a conversation I was having with somebody else earlier in the week, actually, that I think we've got to a point now where so many people have access to the games that, because of draft breakdown, because of the various things on YouTube, you can go back and watch condensed games that are like 30 minutes long. They just cut the ad breaks and all the stoppages out, and you can just watch these games. And I think, everybody's an expert now. And one of the issues with this, it's like we're saturated with opinions and takes. And, guys who are good, like Leonard Fournette and Jabril Peppers and others in the past, they've been considered good for so long that what actually happens is someone of them watches a game and they don't really do anything. And then they write an article and say, yeah, this guy is actually not quite as good as everybody thinks he is. And then, you see more and more of that. The expectation is becoming so unrealistic with these. I've heard some criticism of Leonard Fournette, and I'm thinking, what are you watching? What games are you watching here? You're saying that this guy's no good. You're saying that, or that he's too much of a straight runner, or he can't bounce out wide, or he can't do this and he can't do that. And I'm thinking, stop focusing on the things that he can't do. Focus on what he can do. These are the things, when you watched him for the first time last year or 2 years ago, and you saw him absolutely tearing the SEC a new backside, what were you thinking then? Don't just go and watch the 2 Alabama games and then say, well, yeah, because of this, that, and the other, he's no good now. And I think there's a bit of that with Jabril Peppers. And what I saw when I watched Peppers was a guy who was constantly involved. So he was always around the ball. People don't realize this. I've seen a lot of complaints about the fact he only had 1 interception all year. He's a safety / linebacker type. He had 15 tackles for a loss, Kenny. 15 tackles for a loss playing safety linebacker. That's as many as some of the best defensive ends in the country. You could go, I bet if you have a look, I bet Jonathan Allen hasn't got 15 tackles for a loss. I mean, he'd be in that kind of range, maybe. He plays defensive tackle. This is a guy who's got 15 tackles for a loss, 3.5 sacks, 7 quarterback hurries and a forced fumble. He's averaging, I'm just looking at the numbers here, as a rusher on offense, 6.19 yards per play. Every time he touched the ball as a runner, 6 yards per play when he was running the football on offense. And, people can say, well, he's only a return guy and he does this, that, and the other. Well, I've just given you 15 tackles for a loss, 7 QB hurries, 6 yards every time he ran the football on average. And then you add the fact that he's a good return man as well. And I'm thinking people are overthinking this, and I hope they do. I hope he falls to the Seahawks because, he's a really, really good player who is going to have a really good career, and I just think people are overthinking this one.
And what sort of do you see any sort of ideal fit team that's looking for Jabril Peppers in that top 20 range that was going to make a lot of sense, and sort of as a guy who's, I think his size is somewhat like just disputed or over, he plays so big that people think that he maybe is bigger than he is. I've heard that he's maybe 5'11" and 210 pounds or something like that. And so, like, with the changing way of safeties and linebackers and everything like that, where does he sort of slot in, and which team do you think is going to really benefit from having a guy like Peppers?
Well, someone like Tennessee could be a good slot. They've got a good young team, and you could play him. You could play him at safety in Tennessee. I think that would be a nice one for them. He potentially, if the Browns go with Myles Garrett, the first pick, I think they're going to be picking in the top 10 again. If they could get near him, is Garrett and Jabril Peppers a good sort of, 1-2 punch with the first round of the draft for them? Yes, it would be. That'd be a good fit for them. I would have said the Jets, just because they could play him in that kind of Deion Buchanan role that Todd Bowles had at Arizona. They could play him in that kind of a role, but they drafted Daron Lee a year ago, and I think they've kind of used him in that position. So I'm not sure they would do that, but he could be an option for them as well. The Bears could maybe use a good strong safety, so they could be an option. There are many teams in that top 10. San Diego is another one as well. Since Eric Weddle left, they've got a need at safety. So there's a lot of teams that could use him. Carolina, New Orleans. There are many suitors. I don't expect him to fall down the draft like some are suggesting.
Moving back to the Seahawks in the NFL, you wrote yesterday about repairing the running game for the Seattle Seahawks and what they can do, whether it's on the offensive line or at running back, and investing in free agency or the draft. Today also, Doug Martin it was announced that he was suspended for 4 games, and because of that, the Bucs can void his contract after this season, it sounds like. And that's, they're based all the guaranteed money, and it could be that just less than a year after they signed Doug Martin to the big, for a running back, free agent contract, which that I tell teams not to do, that they could be moving away from Doug Martin. He's had a really horrible year, so I don't know. So that whatever he was taking, they said it was performance-enhancing drugs. Whatever it was, it didn't work out for him on the field this season. And he also said he's going into rehab. So then it could be Adderall, or it could be some other form of recreational drugs that could also be classified as performance-enhancing. So with Doug Martin being potentially out there, does that factor into your thoughts at all for the Seahawks next season? Is Doug Martin a guy that could be for sort of a fit if he was looking for a new team? And in terms of the draft, how much can we expect to really get in offensive line help from the draft, given that we know that they're again going to be picking at the bottomish half of the first round, and we know that their picks of second and third and fourth and fifth round picks at offensive line haven't worked out that well?
It's going to be really interesting to see what they do, Kenny, because they've got options. In fairness, they're going to have about $40 million in cap space. They're not going to be able to spend all of that on free agents. Some of it's going to be saved for the practice squad injured reserve. Some of it's going to probably go towards Michael Bennett and Cam Chancellor's new deals, maybe Jimmy Graham as well. They're going to have to sign players like Stephen Hauschka if they want to, or several, like Luke Wilson's out of contract. There are players like that. So they're not going to be able to spend all of the $40 million, but there was options there if they wanted to go and look at someone like Kevin Zietler, who is the guard at Cincinnati. They could throw $10 million a year his way and say, okay, we're going to get one of the best guards in the NFL. Ronald Leary is in Dallas and has had a really good year for them. Is it because of him playing in Dallas, or is it because he's really good? They could look at signing somebody like that. There are going to be offensive tackles that they could look at in the veteran market as well. There are going to be some options there. So they could do free agency. They could look at the draft. We've talked a lot about Garrett Bowles. I think Garrett Bowles is the best offensive tackle in college football. And I don't think it's really close. And I think it's exactly the type of player the Seahawks need. And that's whether or not they want to keep George Fant at left tackle. They could play Bowles at right tackle. His demeanor, his talent, his physicality, his attitude, his personality, his grit, his backstory, everything screams Seahawks. I would love to see Garrett Bowles in Seattle. I just happen to think that he's going to go in the top 15 picks because he's that good and he's the most underrated player in college football. If it's not him, that I still think they have to do something. I mean, listening to Pete Carroll talk earlier about the offensive line, it made me sort of change my mind. I kind of thought yesterday when I wrote the article that they probably will be aggressive in free agency, and then when I listened to Carroll, I kind of thought, yeah, he still believes that this is a very young line that needs growth, that needs time, that they've put their faith in these guys, and that they're not just going to completely blow it up. And what they actually might do is just add competition, and go that route. So, I could maybe see a combination of a bit of free agency and a bit of the draft. And if it's the draft, they could look at people like Adam Bisnawati, who we've talked about a lot on the podcast before. Should say his name correctly, Bisnawati. He to me, he plays wearing number 69, which is Evan Mathis's number. He looks a lot like Evan Mathis. He's a left tackle. He could go in the third round range, which is where Mathis went. I think he could be a really nice bit of competition for Mark Lewinsky at left guard. Chad Wheeler is a left tackle at USC. Could be somebody they look at. There's a guard at USC who's enormous called Damian Mama. They could look at him. Dorian Johnson, the guard at Pittsburgh. There's actually quite a lot of mid-round options that they could bring in to add competition. And then it's the running back thing, Kenny, because nobody wants to really write off Thomas Rawls and nobody wants to write off CJ Procise, but because neither of them have stayed healthy, you kind of feel like they need to do something. They have to bring somebody in. I personally would not be interested in Doug Martin. But I was reading an article by Chris Sproul of ESPN earlier, and he was listing sort of he got the sort of the reporters, the Shield Kapadia is the Seahawks one, the ESPN reporters for each team, and he asked them all for their biggest free agent decision that is coming up for each team. And the one that kind of interested me the most, and I wonder what you think about this, Kenny, was the Minnesota guy talked about Adrian Peterson. And Peterson has been out with a knee injury. He's had knee injuries in the past and come back. He's due something ridiculous like $18 million next year, which is not going to happen. So there's two options, really. Either Minnesota does a deal with him to come back on a much smaller contract and he stays in Minnesota, or he may request to be released and test free agency. And I like the idea of Adrian Peterson in Seattle. I mean, I like the idea of saying, okay, we're not going to write off Rawls and Procise. What we're going to do is we're going to bring in somebody who could play 1 year, 1 or 2 years maybe, experienced, talented, legendary running back, and bring him in on a deal which is like pays him 8-10 million or whatever Marshawn Lynch was earning, and just get him out there. And what have you got to lose? I mean, if he gets injured again, well, at least you tried to do something. At least you're not spending a first-round pick, or at least you're not trading up for Leonard Fournette. At least you're not just bringing in another fourth-rounder who might not do anything like Alex Collins or whatever. At least you're trying to do something. And, I'd be very interested in that move. And that to me is just sort of something that would make sense, because Peterson maybe feels like maybe he wants a change of scenery. And, he's not going to go to Dallas. He's not going to go to some other teams. Seattle, is a team that want to run the ball. They're a contender. It would help him try and get a Super Bowl title before he retires. And it feels like they're going to have to make some kind of calculated gamble this offseason to get this going. And I just wonder whether Adrian Peterson is a guy that maybe they could consider.
Yeah, I think, he's going to be 32 years old, and he was awful this year when he played. And from what I understand, or from what I remember, as bad as the offensive line in the Minnesota Vikings is, he also contributed to his averaging 1.9 yards per carry, that there was still something, and, with the injury and everything like that, you just come back and you see how it works next year. I definitely would imagine that Adrian Peterson's going to come back. And you could also look at someone like Frank Gore, who, was 32 when he signed with the Indianapolis Colts, and he's played really well in the last 2 years and can at least handle the job, not playing behind a great offensive line there in Indianapolis, and he's been effective. So I definitely think that with someone of Adrian Peterson's athletic profile and history of being in shape, that there's a very good chance that he will play next year and be good and not be maybe not be the normal Adrian Peterson that we had become accustomed to, but certainly a good running back. So, there, like you said, there's no way he's going to make $18 million. So if they can't negotiate something with Minnesota, and the Vikings have so many issues to deal with on that offense, that it might be best interest for them to, find a way to come to some sort of agreement with Peterson so that they have one less thing to worry about. And they can at least say to their fans and to their team and to the locker room, we're going to have this continuity here with Peterson, the best player in our franchise's history. And we're going to come back with him, and he's going to retire a Viking. Okay. So let's try and figure everything else out. And that's where I sort of would rest that and think about that. And it's crazy because it was not less than 2 years ago that the whole situation with the child abuse and everything like that, where it seemed like Peterson, he had been suspended for the whole season, and then was he ever going to come back? And then he did come back, and he led the NFL in rushing in 2015. So he's not far removed from being perhaps the best running back in the NFL, even though now I think we're in an interesting era of football, because I've spent so much time the last 3 years on, this podcast and other shows and writing about it, how the running back in the NFL is dead, and then it's a dead position where you don't want to invest money in it, and you don't want to invest high draft picks in it, and they just aren't the stars that they used to be, because passing has taken over and these guys are getting injured too much, and there's too many, because they get injured a lot, there's too much sharing around teams in terms of having two running backs and everything like that. But now you look at it and you can start to see how that's shifting again when Ezekiel Elliott comes in as a rookie and leads the NFL in rushing yards by a huge margin. And you can say Elliott is a star running back. David Johnson is a star running back. Le'Veon Bell is a star running back. And, Jay Ajayi is getting better and better. Jordan Howard is getting better. LaShawn McCoy is a star running back. And then you got the guys that aren't even star running backs, like LeGarrette Blount, who has 17 touchdowns, Latavius Murray, who has 12 touchdowns, Devonta Freeman, who has 10 touchdowns, and Melvin Gordon, who has 10 touchdowns, and DeMarco Murray, who's had a resurgence with the Tennessee Titans. There's more now to build around this idea of a running back, just as we get in next year when Dalvin Cook, Christian McCaffrey, and Leonard Fournette enter the NFL, as well as, a host of other, good players in the draft next year. It's an interesting time for running backs. And one of the only teams that doesn't have a star running back this season is the Seahawks, who, lose Marshawn Lynch to retirement and, his declining 2015 season. And we thought we would be able to come back with Thomas Rawls. But, he's been injured and the offensive line has been really bad. And you look at it, and the leading rusher for the Seahawks, being Kristen Michael still with his 400 and some yards that he had in Seattle. The leading rusher, the leading rusher that's still on the Seahawks, Thomas Rawls, has 335 yards. That's 58th in the NFL. He's rushed for less yards this year than Blake Bortles. Obviously he's played in a lot, and he's played in fewer games and gotten, not that many opportunities. But it's just interesting what you would have thought before the year, with the fact that they did have Rawls and Procise and Kristen Michael, that they couldn't possibly fail that many times. But it seems like they've added at least 20 running backs this year alone, and I'm not exaggerating. At least 20 with the guys that they have drafted, with the guys that they signed. Look at all the guys that we've cycled through with Troy Maine Pope and, and all these other guys. And it just gets more and more, Kelvin Taylor, and it's just a new guy. They just worked out, 5 guys, including Stephen Ridley. And it was just, there's so many guys coming through that you do have to have some sort of idea of like, okay, is it going to be Thomas Rawls and CJ Procise and Alex Collins, and how many more guys do we add in, and how much of a draft pick do we put into it again, and how many free agent dollars, because it's not going to be Marshawn Lynch lightning in a bottle, opportunity again. You wouldn't think. It has to be some sort of area of focus for the Seahawks, of course. And one of the guys that I mentioned, Jordan Howard, that was a surprising one that the Seahawks passed on in the draft. Any thoughts on what thoughts you had about Jordan Howard in the draft this year, and if he would have been a fit to the Seahawks?
Yeah, I liked him, and I remember I wrote about him. I think it was after they played Michigan, and he'd had a really good game a year ago, and he was tough, he was physical, but then you do a bit more research into it, and that's when I came across the this is the great thing about having consistency with the coaching staff, and you can find their trends in the draft, and the players that they have drafted at running back have nearly all been the same size and with the same physical profile. They're nearly all 5'10", 5'11", 225 pounds, and they run a certain way and they jump a certain way and all this. And when you went down the list of players that they might consider who sort of fit those physical ideals, I think there was pretty much two in the last draft, and one was CJ Procise, who they took, and the other was, I think, Kenneth Dixon, who is in Baltimore right now. So when I saw that, I kind of stopped focusing on Howard, because I didn't think they were going to take him, and did actually mock Procise to Seattle, and I think I put him in round 4 instead of round 3, but put him to the Seahawks specifically because of those physical ideals. So I liked him, but I didn't think they were going to draft him. And then this year, you kind of think, well, are they going to do anything differently? Are they going to draft a bigger back? Do they need a bell cow type guy? Or are they going to continue with this kind of ideal size that they've had in the past? And I do think they're going to maybe try and get a bit of bigger size in there. But they have to do something, Kenny. This team is so... The run game is so important for this team. It's not like a lot of other teams. It's not like Green Bay, where Aaron Rodgers is the team and everything else is kind of a supporting cast. It's everything is connected. The running game sets the tone. It's physical. It lets the opponent know what the Seahawks are going to be. It allows them to feed off that and have explosive plays off play action in the passing game. It helps, draw 8 men into the box. It helps keep Jimmy Graham clean. It stops teams putting sort of 2 and 3 guys on Jimmy Graham because they have to concentrate on the run. And alternatively, that helps the defense, and because they're so physical on offense, and they can win time of possession, they can tire teams out. It keeps the defense fresh. It allows them to manage games and be in front, and then that gives an opportunistic defense a chance to force turnovers, which are down. There's a great fan post on field goals today by Bucky Alexander, which is talking about the fact that the Seahawks are I think they're on for a franchise low in terms of turnovers this year, and that's not because Byron Maxwell's not on the team anymore. It's because, for me, it's because the run game is completely evaporated. If you don't run, then you can't do everything else in Seattle. And this is not going to be a case of, hey, let's just have an undrafted rookie back there running the ball and some big guys up front and we'll be okay. I think it's more than that. I think this team needs someone special in that backfield, and it needs good blocking. And it needs to be a focal point, and there needs to be a commitment to it when they've got those guys, that they're going to run the ball, that they're going to do this, they're going to do that. They're going to make sure that it's the identity of this team. And I don't think they've got that right now. And that's why I think they need to be aggressive. They need to have somebody in that backfield who, on Monday morning, the week before the game, the opponent's thinking, crap, how the hell are we going to stop this guy while also covering Jimmy Graham, while also containing Russell Wilson and Doug Baldwin? How are we going to do this? That's what they need. I don't think they've got that right now. And that's why I kind of think Adrian Peterson, if he became a free agent, would be a good option, because he is that type of player. And there aren't many in the league that are going to be available in this offseason. And unless they go for the draft, unless they've fallen in love with Deontay Foreman, or whether they think that they could make a move for Fournette or Cook, or whether they feel like, there's some gem out there that, is going to be really good for them, or like a bit of an unknown, I don't know. But it feels like they need to do something. And it means repairing the O-line, or at least getting better play from the O-line, however they do that. And I think it means getting at least one really exciting player in the backfield next year to play with Procise and Rolls.
Yeah, it's like the amount of times that I've forgotten about CJ Procise is infinite, but it's like this is still a guy that could return to the playoffs if they get, that deep enough into the playoffs to allow him to return from his broken scapula. And, at that point, he was such a dynamic player that the future with CJ Procise could be something really special, but we just don't know yet because he hasn't been on the field enough, and whether or not he will ever be the type of player who can stay healthy enough to really be relied upon. It's yet to be determined. I don't want to put that on a player after less than one season. I was just looking at the fact that Frank Gore has had 1,200 total yards every single year since 2006. Frank Gore was one of the biggest injury concerns, that of his era when he was at Miami, and just the fact that he couldn't stay on the field at Miami, and he's so healthy and so consistent for the last 11, 12 years. It's really incredible. So you wouldn't put that sort of pressure on a young guy to live up to those expectations, but certainly anything is possible at this point with Procise. And yeah, the last thing that I really want to talk about is sort of going back and just continuing to talk about the Seahawks offensive line. I just quickly sort of wrote a thing today about Germain Ifedi and whether or not he was the worst guard in the NFL. I'm not one to say that he is or isn't. That's, as far as the starters go, that's a pretty hefty thing for anyone to take on, when there are, 32 teams, and, that means there's 64 starting guards, and, that out of those 64, certainly there's at least 100 probably that have got some starts this year. Is Germain Ifedi, in the lower 70s or 80s or something like that in terms of how he's played this year? That being said, the way that when you mentioned before that Pete Carroll had talked positively about the offensive line, Tom Cable said that Germain Ifedi has been dominant in the last few games, that he needs to clean up his false starts. The false starts are a problem, but, some would say that the pass protection for everybody is a problem. And as far as whether or not Germain Ifedi, who was, their first round pick, and certainly someone that when everyone says, hey, look, invest in the offensive line, use draft picks on the offensive line. Hey, there's an example right there. They did the best they could with the draft pick they had, other than the fact that, that they traded down 5 spots, which I don't think anyone would disagree with. They picked up a 3rd rounder, which turned into Nick Vannett. And, there's 2 players instead of 1. So it's great. They did the best they could, in their opinion, with using that pick on an offensive lineman. They used one on James Carpenter. They used one on Russell Okung. They've used several draft picks, including a 2nd rounder on Justin Britt. They've put something in there, even if it hasn't worked out that well. But now it's like Germain Ifedi. If Tom Cable is going to go to bat for him, and if Pete Carroll is going to go for a bat for him, you expect Germain Ifedi to be the starter there next season, and they probably hope that he just gets more time working next to Justin Britt. But certainly we don't have any idea who will be the starting right tackle. George Fant at left tackle and Mark Lewinsky at left guard. Those 3 positions all seem to be up for grabs, including perhaps a transition for Ifedi to another one of those spots on the offensive line. So, now that we've had 15 games or 15 weeks, Germain Ifedi missed the first 3 games, but now that we've had some time to look at it, and I know we talk about this on a regular basis, but just thoughts on Germain Ifedi perhaps being such a disappointment at guard for some this year, as opposed to the words of his coaches, and any sort of inclination or hope in the other 3 spots? Or do you think that and maybe like Mark Lewinsky is maybe we're talking too much about him having a bad year because everybody on the offensive line except for Britt is having a bad year? Or maybe he does deserve to have his spot questioned, and he was sort of, in a way gifted that spot because there wasn't any competition at the time, and the other guys didn't really work out. So thoughts on Ifedi and the other offensive linemen?
Well, to answer the question, has Jermaine Ifedi been the worst, or is he the worst guard in the NFL? I would ask a counter question of, has Mark Glowinski been any better? I mean, this is the issue for me. I think if you took Jermaine Ifedi and said, right, you're starting instead of Ronald Leary on Dallas's offensive line, he'd probably look like one of the best guards in the NFL, playing next to Travis Frederick and Doug Free and Zach Martin and Tyrone Smith. The problem that he's got, and it's the same for the others as well, is that George Fant has barely played any football. He's a basketball player playing left tackle. This is his first year in the NFL, and he's playing left tackle. Mark Glowinski may have had a redshirt year last year. This is his first year in the NFL. Justin Britt has played for a few years. This is his first year at centre. Jermaine Ifedi's never played in the NFL until this year. And there's been a turnstile musical chairs situation at right tackle where 1 minute it's Jamarcus Webb, then it's Gary Gilliam, then it's Bradley Sowell, now it's Gary Gilliam again. Now, none of this is conducive to a good, solid, consistent performing offensive line. And because of all of those things are going on, and because nobody's particularly playing well, and because everybody's so green and new and inexperienced, it's leading to, I think, a situation where everybody's playing poorly. And there's a real lack of leadership on that line, and that's the reason why I think they've struggled. I'm not in the least bit concerned about Jermaine Ifedi's long-term future. I mean, you know, I don't expect first-round picks to come in and suddenly be brilliant. I think it's going to take time, and I think especially that is the case with Seattle's offensive line. I think it is going to take time for all of them. I don't know if they're all going to get the time, because the problem that Seattle's got now is that they have to decide whether or not they want to see through these massive growing pains with these 5 guys, or 4 guys, presuming they do something at right tackle, because Gary Gilliam and Bradley Sowell are probably going to be replaced. See through the growing pains and hope for the best, and run the risk of having another bad year in 2017 with this group. Or do they go out and blow it up and start again and start spending money in free agency and start spending more first-round picks and stuff like that? That's the dilemma that they're faced with right now. But I do think there is scope to bring in, you know, to be a little bit aggressive there and just say, look, we're in a championship window. You know, there's not long to go. You know, there's not going to be another 5 years with this group, I don't think. So maybe you do go out there and see if the San Francisco 49ers will give you Joe Staley for a 3rd-round pick. Maybe you do go out there and see if Kevin Zeitler will come in on a $8 to $10 million a year contract. Maybe you do go and see if Ricky Wagner is willing to play for $4 or $5 million. Maybe you do go and see if Ronald Leary is going to do that. I don't know. I really don't know what they're going to do. I'm going to be fascinated to see what they do. But I think there's an obvious reason why they've struggled, and it is just that general lack of experience. And I think it's hurt all of them individually. I don't think Jermaine Ifedi has been as bad as some people think. I think the problem that Jermaine Ifedi has got is that he's a first-round pick, so everybody expects him to be really good. People don't really have that expectation with Fant or with Glowinski, but they have it with Ifedi. So I'm willing to sort of give him the benefit of the doubt for now, and we'll see where he is in a year's time.
Did you think that you'd have any, if you could, I mean, and the thing is, Jermaine Ifedi was a tackle, and there's no reason to say, you know, that he was forced into being a guard. They would prefer, I'm sure at this point, they would prefer he was a good right tackle, because that's been their biggest problem all year long. And especially if he could be a good left tackle. And I realized there was a reason why he went 31st overall. And the other guys that went ahead of him, like Taylor Decker and Laramie Tunsil and Ronnie Stanley, and the guy for Tennessee, that they all went ahead of him. And, you know, the fact that they're all doing pretty well, I think Ronnie Stanley is, you know, getting a lot really high grades, and I think that high marks, and I think that the guy for Tennessee whose name I just can't ever think about it, because I always want to say Taylor Lewan or Taylor Decker. You know, people saying that he's, you know, been a phenomenal right tackle. If you think any of those guys were playing on the Seahawks this year, how big of a difference would it be between them and Jermaine Ifedi? I mean, it's a tough speculation, but how big is the difference between, you know, maybe one of those 4 guys joining the Seahawks and maybe playing tackle and Jermaine Ifedi?
Well, I think they'd struggle as well. I mean, if the Seahawks had taken Taylor Decker instead, and he was, let's say, starting at right tackle or left tackle, would the situation be any different? No, I think the offensive line would be exactly the same as it is. It's just that there'd be a different, inexperienced guy on there. I mean, that's the issue. It's the general inexperience. I do think if Jermaine Ifedi was playing in a really confident, performing O line then I think he'd be really good. I also think this. I have to say, Kenny, and I genuinely think that the Seahawks helped have helped contribute to this issue on the offensive line with the way that they've approached this whole thing. I mean, they've shown such a lack of commitment to the running game in recent weeks, where they've kind of like flirted with being committed to it, but not really fully committed to it. That I think that the O line has lost confidence. I think that it's galvanizing for an offensive line when you line up and you run the ball down someone's throat. And the Seahawks are not doing that. Against Arizona, they came out throwing the ball, and it was almost an admission that we're going to put the white flag out here. We don't think we can run the ball with these linemen against your defensive linemen, so we're going to have to throw it. And what happened? They still pulverized the offensive line, sacked Russell Wilson, forced them into trying everything under the sun on their playbook to try and find any kind of production, and they just couldn't do it. And it took them till half time to try and adjust and sort things out. I genuinely believe if they'd have just committed to running the ball, and if they had a healthy running back who was consistently playing behind them, and if Russell Wilson was healthy and they could use some read option, I think we'd be seeing a much better offensive line. But when you're not running the ball and you're asking them to pass protect and you're asking them to be, technical as opposed to just, physical, get in there and smack the guy in front of you and create a lane for this guy. I think that's contributed to it. And if people remember in pre-season, Seahawks were running the ball really well. And this offensive line looked pretty good as well. I mean, they were productive in preseason running the football with this O line and these running backs. So with Christian Michael as well. So I think that they've contributed to the downfall of the running game and the performance of the O line by I think they've not the confidence. And I think, do you know what? When I saw that quote that you made there about Tom Cable saying that Jermaine Ifedi's been dominant, of course, I think most people would say that that's not true. I think he's just trying to give him a confidence boost. I think they're trying to pump these guys up this week. I think they're going to try and get them going. And I think they're hoping that if they can run the ball all over San Francisco at the weekend, which they should be able to do given the way their defense has played this year, that might give them the confidence to go into the playoffs and actually believe in this. But they have to commit to the run, give these young offensive linemen some confidence, do what they are good at, do what they were brought here to do. These guys were not drafted to pass protect for Peyton Manning. They were brought here to run the ball in Seattle. The Seahawks run the thing. That's what the Seahawks do, and they're not running the ball. So make life easier for them. Run the ball. Let's see if they can show some strides, and I think they will if they actually commit to this.
One last question being, since you brought up the free agent market, if you could have one free agent splash for the Seahawks, and it had to be one of these two guys, would you rather that it was Kevin Zeitler or K'Wan Short, the defensive tackle for the Panthers?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think I would probably rather go with. It's so you can make. Let me sort of give the case for both quickly, and then it might help me decide. Because if you bring in Zeitler, you've got a really consistent offensive lineman in there. A guy who's a former first round pick who's been really solid for Cincinnati. And you might say, okay, for 5 years you've tied up an offensive line spot, and it helps give this line some veteran experience and improve that. And that might be the thing the Seahawks need. But then I also think the one thing they really need is some interior disruption on defense. And they've never had a guy like K'Wan Short since Carroll took over. They've not had somebody who, I know he's not had the sacks that he's had in previous years, but he's got tackles. He's got numerous tackles for a loss. He is still impacting games. And if they had someone like him who could sort of just plow through the middle, make life a little bit easier for the edge rushers, I think that could be really beneficial too. Now, the other thing might be that K'Wan Short's probably going to be a $15 to $17 million a year player, whereas Zeitler might be a $10 million a year player. So financially, it might be beneficial to go with Zeitler instead. I don't know. I'd love either. I'd kind of say I wouldn't complain with either. I would be pleased and would welcome both to the Seahawks. I don't think that Kawan Short will hit the market. I think that Carolina will keep him one way or another. Zeitler's kind of up in the air. So I guess I've just written a piece talking about, in fact, I know what I want to say. I know I'm going to answer this. So because the draft is better for defensive linemen, big defensive linemen, I will say Zeitler, because it will mean that you will give yourself a chance to improve the offensive line, potentially improve the running game. And it also means that you can tap into what is the greatest strength in this draft, which is going to be defense, I think. And while there are some good guard options in the middle rounds, Forrest Lamp, Bisnavotti, Dorian Johnson, a couple of others, I genuinely believe that, you take Zeitler there, and it sort of just gives you a little bit more freedom and flexibility. So I'll go with him.
One final thing to talk about, predictions for the Seahawks game, the Falcons game, and who you think the Seahawks will be playing in the first round.
Okay, so I said before the Arizona game that I would expect the Seahawks to win the next 2 games. They've lost to Arizona. So I'm going to predict the Seahawks will win against San Francisco, but I'm not. I say that with no real confidence that they're actually going to do it. As I mentioned, they have the look of a 9-7 team. They'll be 9-6-1 if they lose. So I'm a little bit worried about the game, and I wasn't at all last week. But I'm going to say that they win the game because San Francisco have been terrible all year. I think Atlanta will, again, I think they will win handsomely. I'm thinking something like 38-21 or something like that. Maybe even more significant. I think New Orleans are going to have the tummies tickled in that game. And then I think the Seahawks will play Washington. I think they'll play Washington in the playoffs in the first round. And I will say that I think that is a winnable game. I genuinely believe that is a winnable game. But then if they have to go to Atlanta the following week and try and win in Atlanta, I would not be confident of them doing that at all.
I mean, that's what it really comes down to is, it's not so much whether or not the Seahawks can get to the second round either way. It's just that difference of playing at home or playing on the road in the second round, because I think hosting a wild card team like Washington or let's say Detroit, if the Packers win this weekend and the Redskins lose, I think those are winnable, definitely very winnable, easy-ish for being first-round games, and definitely going to the second round. But hosting a team like Detroit or Washington or the Giants in the second round, as opposed to going to Atlanta, that's where the huge, significant difference comes in, and having to win there, because that's how they got knocked out in 2012. That's how they got knocked out in 2015. The 2 years where they got the first round bye, they went to the Super Bowl. So, that's the big difference. But then if you get past that, then it probably doesn't matter anymore what the seeding was. If you get into that conference, if you can win that second game on the road against the Falcons or whatever it is, then maybe you're going on the road to face the Cowboys. And maybe if you're really lucky, you're going home to face the Giants. And then then that's that. So anybody that's in the playoffs this year has some semblance of a chance. And I believe the Seahawks should be, fourth or fifth among them in those chances, mostly because of the loss of Earl Thomas and the continual deterioration of the offensive line. Thomas Rawls was a full participant in practice today, and Cam Chancellor didn't participate at all. So there you go. And that's it for this episode of 3000 NFL Mock Draft. Stay tuned next week as we'll wrap up the Seahawks season, and we'll see where they're playing in the playoffs and how that all works out. And, we'll be closer to those college football playoffs and seeing who's going to win the national championship, as well as the Huskies versus Alabama, and so much more. And we'll know more players who are going to be entering the draft next year, including perhaps Garrett Bowles of Utah. Follow Rob on Twitter at Rob Staten. Go to SeahawksDraftBlog.com and FieldGoals.com. This has been this edition of 3000 NFL Mock Draft. Come back next week for a brand new draft.